Since 2015, the Liberal government have wasted so much money that they're now trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. They're giving out checks, food's too expensive, houses are expensive, no one can afford to even buy a house in Canada. So how or why did this happen? And could they have taken a different track from 2015 up until now, 2023?
We calculate basically an alternative fiscal path for the government if they had been more restrained with spending since 2015. So if they tied spending, for instance, to population growth and inflation, and then even if we assume that, they have all this emergency spending during COVID, coming out of COVID, if they had been more responsible with their spending and returned it to levels that they had previously forecasted, what we find is they could have actually introduced about $19 billion of tax relief this year while still running a surplus of nearly $5 billion. So there's a significant difference between the path that they took versus what they could have done with the money instead.
$19 billion deficit. What if they could have saved that money rather than giving out grocery checks and short-term fixes? What would the tax relief been if the government could have saved that $19 billion and put it back into the system?
Yeah, well, if the federal government had created this new fiscal space by running surpluses, what they could have actually done is reduce the tax rate that they had already reduced back in 2016. So they previously reduced that second lowest personal income tax rate from 22 to 20.5%. What they could have done is actually brought this all the way down to 15%. So this would have been a substantial reduction in taxes for a number of middle-class families, as they like to talk about. So I think that was, one of the interesting things when we were going through this analysis. Is just how much tax relief they could have actually offered. It essentially eliminates that second lowest personal income tax rate. It means that you're only paying that 15% rate from about $15,000 all the way up to about $106,000 on that incremental income.
Canadians need a fix. They need something to happen. Like the government have spent $28 billion on funding a billion-dollar company like Volkswagen and Stellantis to build electric car battery plants, but they won't pause the carbon tax. They won't help Canadians, but they'll help foreign companies. And really what Canadians need is instant help. They need, wipe out the carbon tax, put a pause on it for a couple of years until the recession dies down.
I think that's an important point, too, because, moving forward, it's kind of about repeating those past mistakes, too, just increasing spending more, acquiring even more debt. Ultimately, there's a trade-off because then what you're giving up is that potential permanent tax relief that's really tangible for families moving forward. It's not just kind of a one-off lump sum payment or anything like that. It's actually something that, is a long-term thing in terms of tax relief. So you could have actually been, reducing tax rates, giving people with a break on those tax bills that have been rising for some time. But instead, what we're seeing is just rising spending, rising debt. Ultimately, that's going to mean even future tax increases that we could see as well. So it's really compounding the problem rather than, solving it.
So what happens when the new government gets in? When Poilievre gets in, he says he's going to cancel the carbon tax. Can he do that? Is that something that's possible even though he's running on doing it? Can he do it?
Yeah, ultimately it's a good question. It remains to be seen, what's going to be done by, any potential government or anything like that. But, ultimately what we have seen over time is, this rising tax bill for families. Now it's consuming about 46% of the annual income for the average family. And that's up from, only a few years ago where it was 43 or 44%. So we, regardless of kind of the different taxes that we're looking at, we have seen this increase in the tax bill for the average family. And that's certainly one of the concerns right now with cost of living being top of mind for so many families.
Because of the deficits, we've got municipal governments like Ontario and Toronto who want to increase taxes. And we've then got a federal government that just wants to spend, send money to everywhere. How do we deal with that?
Well, and I think that's a good point because one of the cautionary notes, especially now that we're, have seen Toronto propose this municipal sales tax too, there really isn't any discussion on the other side of the ledger on, what they can do to reform spending. It's really now just about new revenue tools, new ways of raising money. And I think that's a cautionary note for other governments too, and other Canadians too, because that's ultimately becoming the trend right now. It's really just looking at new ways of generating revenue, and ultimately that means new taxes. Or raising taxes ultimately, and there isn't enough discussion, even close to enough discussion on what they can actually do on spending restraint or spending reform. So I think that part really needs to enter the discussion for so many governments now.
Well, we have mayors like Chow in Toronto who want to raise taxes, raise sales tax, raise tax on everything that you buy, 1%. Now, 1% on, like, say, a Mars bar isn't a lot. But what happens if you want to buy a new car, a $26,000 car, and you want to buy it, let's just say you're going to buy it in Toronto, the $26,000 car, 1%. It's a lot of money. Will people go out of town to buy a car? Why can't governments look to save money rather than tax people to spend more money?
I mean, it's a good question. It remains to be seen how they can do that. I think part of it, though, is having, specific rules that you have tied to your spending. And I think that's really where it starts to, because right now, governments are just kind of spending money left and right, not necessarily having a formula or something driving, how much they can impose a level of restraint on that spending. So then they're looking to those revenue tools when they, exceed, any level of spending restraint that's necessary. So I think, that's really the first step before we kind of go beyond, thinking about new revenue tools or revenue generation in that sense, is really having that self-imposed spending restraint at the municipal, provincial, federal levels that we aren't really seeing right now across Canada.
Yeah, that is a frightening thought. We've got governments who are wanting to tax and tax and tax, and carbon tax, and there's tax on, like, municipal governments. They want to tax houses. If you sell your house, they want more money on that. They want to stick a sales tax on, another 1%. But they won't stop the spending. They want a record amount of MPs in Parliament, record amount of MPs, at Queen's Park at Toronto. They just won't stop spending, and we're paying for it. Till next time.